They thought it would be funny. A prank at a school party, a way to laugh at the quiet classmate everyone ignored. He was different, a single father, always tired but always polite. To them, that made him easy to mock. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, their arrogance would be exposed in front of everyone. What was meant to humiliate him would become the moment that silenced an entire room and changed how they saw themselves forever. Because sometimes the man they underestimate is the one they should admire the most. It was a quiet morning in a small suburban town, the kind where everyone drove the same route to work and sent their kids to the same school. Elijah Daniels did both, a single father who worked long hours at a local tech firm and still managed to pack his daughter's lunch every day. To his classmates, though, he was just the quiet dad, older than most, with skin darker than theirs and a life they couldn't begin to understand. He kept to himself, polite, humble, and always exhausted. Between late nights coding and early mornings helping his daughter with homework, Elijah barely had time to rest. He wasn't flashy, didn't talk about money, and certainly didn't flaunt his success, though there was far more to his life than anyone realized. At the school gate, whispers often followed him. Some parents smiled politely. Others looked through him like he wasn't there. His daughter never mentioned it, but Elijah knew. The reason people stared had nothing to do with his parenting, and everything to do with who he was. When a few arrogant classmates in his business program decided to invite him to a weekend meetup, Elijah thought little of it. They said it was a friendly social night, a casual dinner. He believed them. But behind those smiles was something ugly, something that would soon show exactly how far prejudice can go when jealousy and ignorance hold the steering wheel. He had no idea that by accepting that invitation, he was walking straight into a trap built on mockery, and that the night would end with everyone's perception shattered, including his own. By the end of the week, Elijah almost forgot about the invitation. It came from a group of classmates who rarely spoke to him unless it was about projects or when they needed help with reports. They'd said it was a dinner to celebrate the end of their course, a casual evening, good food, good company. Their tone almost sounded friendly, but beneath it there had always been something faintly mocking, something he chose to ignore. When he arrived, the restaurant was louder than he expected. Laughter spilled from every corner, glasses clinking, music humming low under the chatter. Elijah hesitated by the entrance, adjusting his worn blazer. His wasn't designer but clean, pressed, careful. He always tried to look composed. He spotted them at a large table near the center, all dressed sharp, confident, eyes flicking toward him as he approached. Their smiles were wide but brittle. He could tell. He'd seen those smiles before. Still, he sat down, thanked them for inviting him, and tried to join in. They asked questions that at first sounded polite. Where are you from originally? How's it raising a child alone? Must be tough, huh? Each word dipped in sugar, each pause heavy with judgment. He felt it, the sting behind their friendliness, the smirk hidden just beneath their laughter. They traded stories about weekend trips, new cars, startups, family wealth. Elijah listened quietly, sipping his water. None of them knew he pulled in more income in a month than most of their families did in a year. But he'd never found joy in numbers or possessions. His pride was his daughter, the reason behind every late night, every quiet day in the background. As the evening went on, their jokes got bolder. One of them leaned over and remarked that it was refreshing to see someone like him taking courses they usually saw filled with a different crowd. Another laughed, pretending to soften the comment with a quick, "Just kidding." Elijah felt his throat tighten, his chest heavy, but he smiled politely, refusing to feed into their smallness. He thought about leaving, the urge sharp in his legs. But another classmate offered dessert, pretending nothing was wrong. He stayed, half out of courtesy, half out of curiosity. Why invite him only to sneer? The pattern was painfully familiar. People amused by their own prejudice, proud of cruelty disguised as humor. A few minutes later, something shifted. One of the classmates pulled out his phone, grinning. "Hey, Elijah," he said casually. "We were just talking about cars. Bet you've got something modest, right? Maybe that old Honda you drive." The others chuckled. Elijah's hand froze midway to his glass. He looked around the table. Every face expected him to laugh along, to play the quiet role he'd been assigned. Instead, he set his drink down slowly, eyes calm. Inside, though, something in him trembled, not with fear but with the steady heat of disappointment. He'd promised himself long ago that he wouldn't let anger own him. But humiliation had its own heartbeat, one that pulsed louder with every small, cruel grin thrown his way. Time dragged. Dishes cleared. The night became a blur of noise and subtle hostility, one insult dressed as charm after another. By 9, Elijah stood to leave. "Early day tomorrow," he said. No one rose to greet him. A few waved lazily. One muttered, "Take care, man. Don't work too hard." He walked out into the parking lot, chest tight, teeth clenched. The air was cold, the kind that burns your lungs just enough to remind you you're still alive. He reached his car, not a Honda, though plain enough not to draw attention, and as he opened the door he heard laughter erupt again from inside. It wasn't his imagination now. They were laughing at him. That night he couldn't sleep. He watched his daughter's toy giraffe on the nightstand, her breathing soft from the next room. And he thought about all the years he'd learned to stay silent, to be the good one, polite, in control, invisible. He thought about his mother, who'd told him that sometimes silence was strength, but sometimes it was just permission for others to keep hurting you. Morning came quietly. The next day rolled on as usual, but something inside him had shifted. 2 days later, the university hosted a networking event, one every final year student was asked to attend. Investors, entrepreneurs, alumni, it was a big deal. The same classmates would be there, dressed to impress, hoping to leave a mark. Elijah attended almost out of habit, another step toward finishing his course and moving on. He arrived in his simple grey jacket, laptop bag over his arm. Nothing extravagant. What no one knew, not his peers, not even the dean sitting proudly near the stage, was that one of the featured speakers, the anonymous tech investor funding the school's new innovation grant, was him, Elijah Daniels, CEO of a rapidly growing software firm valued at nearly $100 million. Quiet, deliberate, meticulous. The same father they'd mocked over dinner days before. The event opened with speeches, polite applause echoing through the hall. When they finally announced him, a murmur swept the room. Students whispered, searching the crowd. And as Elijah stood, all those same faces froze. The laughter, the arrogance gone in an instant, replaced by disbelief. He walked steadily to the front, not gloating, not smiling, just calm. Every step echoed louder than the applause that followed. He stopped at the podium, adjusted the microphone, eyes scanning the crowd once. The same students who'd tried to humiliate him sat rigid. Their hands met briefly over their laps, avoiding his gaze. Elijah's voice was steady. He spoke about discipline, perseverance, the cost of dignity. He didn't mention their names. He didn't need to. What they remembered wasn't the number attached to his company, it was the quiet power in how he carried himself. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be revealed at the right moment. And as he left the stage, that moment hung heavy in the air. The startling realization that the man they dismissed had built everything they were still pretending to chase. But for Elijah, the real victory wasn't in proving them wrong. It was walking back to his car later, calling his daughter, and hearing her small voice say, "Hi, Daddy, did you finish your speech?" He smiled for the first time that week. In that tiny voice was his reason, and the one thing worth more than every dollar attached to his name. Still, deep down, he knew the laughter from that dinner would never entirely fade. Not because it hurt, but because it reminded him of how ignorance dresses itself in arrogance, and how powerfully truth can strip it bare. For a long second, Elijah just stood there, on the stage under the burning heat of the spotlight, watching their faces freeze into expressions he would never forget. The same group who had smirked behind coffee mugs and whispered jokes across the table now sat perfectly still, their polished confidence cracked clean open. Their professor blinked, then stared down at the event brochure where his name gleamed next to the line, Major Donor, Tech Innovator. Elijah could feel the pulse in his ears, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. He began talking about struggle, about raising a daughter while building a company from scraps of time and hope. He spoke about being underestimated in rooms like this one, about how invisibility could sometimes be a weapon, how silence sometimes turns into strategy. The hall was silent, except for the distant hum of the air conditioner. Even the cameras stopped clicking. Everyone was listening, really listening. And for once he didn't feel small. He felt seen. He looked toward the table where they sat. No anger in his eyes, no triumph either. Just the quiet kind of truth that leaves people breathless. He didn't need to mention their cruelty. The memory of it was already clawing at their throats. "This," he said softly, "is what dignity looks like when nobody expects it." The applause began hesitantly, then grew, filling the hall with something larger than sound. Some clapped in wonder, some clapped in shame. But for Elijah it wasn't victory, it was release. He stepped down from the stage, heart steady. Behind him the clapping faded, replaced by the whisper of realization spreading through the crowd. They had tried to make him small, and in doing so, revealed just how hollow their own pride was. But the real question lingered in every corner of that room. Who in the end should have been ashamed? When the lights dimmed that evening and the crowds dispersed, Elijah lingered for a moment outside the hall. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the applause had carried away years of other people's assumptions. He could still hear faint echoes from inside, the shuffle of papers, footsteps against the marble floor, the low murmur of those who had finally seen him for who he was. He walked slowly to the parking lot. The same group of classmates by their cars avoided his gaze now, their earlier confidence replaced by discomfort. None of them spoke. He could have said something, anything, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, not as a greeting or forgiveness, but as a quiet acknowledgement of closure. They had seen the truth, and that was enough. As he got into his car, his phone buzzed, a message from his daughter. Just 5 words, "Proud of you, Daddy." He stared at the screen until his vision blurred, and for the first time that night, he smiled fully. Not the polite smile he wore to deflect judgment, but the kind that comes from peace. That short text carried a simple truth. All he ever wanted was to build a different future for her, one where respect wasn't decided by skin or origin, one where wealth wasn't the armor people needed, just to be treated fairly. Yet even now, after the dinner, after the shock on their faces, Elijah knew the world outside that hall hadn't changed overnight. Those smiles of surprise, those murmurs of regret, they would fade, but the lesson would hang somewhere deeper, waiting to be remembered the next time someone underestimated a person because of how they looked or lived. Weeks later, news of the event spread around campus. Stories circulated about the quiet student who turned out to be one of the program's biggest benefactors. Some framed it as poetic justice. Others called it an inspiration. Elijah ignored most of it. He never wanted fame. What mattered was the ripple, small, invisible perhaps, but real. The same classmates who once mocked him began volunteering for community initiatives. Professors started opening discussions about diversity, inclusion, and the cost of unconscious bias. And when Elijah passed through the halls now, people greeted him differently, not with pity or obligation, but genuine warmth. A few of those classmates came up to him, stumbling over apologies. "We didn't realize," one said quietly. Elijah always replied the same way. "That's the problem. You never tried to. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. The kind that forces people to look inward instead of away." At home one night, Elijah sat beside his daughter on the couch. She asked what had really happened that week. He hesitated, then told her. Not the polished version, but the real one. He told her how sometimes people wear arrogance like a crown to hide their own fear. How ignorance can twist into cruelty when it feels safe to laugh at someone different. But he also told her something else, that kindness and quiet strength will always outshine mockery. She listened carefully, her head resting against his arm. "So, you showed them?" she asked softly. "No," he said, watching her eyes begin to drift shut. "They just showed themselves." That night he realized that his story wasn't about revenge. It was about witnessing a moment of clarity in others, the slow unraveling of prejudice when faced with undeniable humanity. He knew it wouldn't end racism, or erase the weight carried by those who face it daily. But maybe in that single evening, something cracked just enough for light to slip through. Because that's how change begins, not with a speech or fortune, but with perspective. One story, one face, one truth that forces people to stop and see what they've ignored for too long. For Elijah, the dinner that began with laughter at his expense ended with silence thick enough to reshape people's understanding of respect. And for everyone watching his story now, the message is the same, simple but unshakable. You never really know who sits quietly beside you, Behind every humble voice is a story. Behind every tired smile, a fight you may never see. And behind every act of cruelty, a choice, one that could be unmade if we were brave enough to look at others with empathy instead of ego. So the next time you find yourself ready to judge someone by what they wear, how they speak, or where they came from, remember Elijah. Remember that every person carries an entire world within them. Pain, pride, hope, the very things that make us human. He drove away from that parking lot with the windows rolled down, city lights blurring through the windshield. Maybe the world hadn't changed entirely that night, but he had. Lighter, freer, unshaken. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He was never the one who needed to. And you, watching this story unfold, should ask yourself one question. How many times do we need to see someone humiliated before we finally understand that respect should never have a price tag? Because the real wealth Elijah carried wasn't in his bank account. It was in the grace to rise above cruelty, and in that quiet, devastating truth that left a room full of laughter turned to silence.